life in the Middle Ages is often imagined as a time of knights in shining armor, grand castles towering over green hills, and noble feasts in candlelit halls. But beneath that romantic picture lay a world far stranger, harsher, and more peculiar than most people today realize. Day-to-day medieval life was shaped by a constant struggle between superstition and survival, religious fervor and local tradition, rigid rules and chaotic realities. In many ways, it was a world governed as much by fear and hope as by law and custom. The medieval period, spanning roughly from the 5th to the late 15th century, was a long and changing era. Europe transformed dramatically during these centuries, yet one constant remained. Life for the average person was deeply unpredictable. Disease, famine, war, and religious authority dominated daily existence. Yet people also danced, laughed, worshipped, married, gossiped, and mourned, often in ways that seem alien to us today. In many medieval towns, rules governed almost every aspect of life, from the shoes one could wear to the food one was allowed to eat on religious days. Some laws seem absurd to modern eyes. Imagine being fined for wearing a tunic that was too brightly colored, or forbidden to play football. Not the organized sport we know today, but a chaotic, violent street brawl with a pig's bladder as the bull. Authority figures, whether kings or church officials, issued countless edicts attempting to regulate behavior, enforce social classes, and prevent disorder, often with results that bordered on the bizarre. Yet medieval laws were only one part of a stranger tapestry. Medicine, for example, was based on ancient theories about bodily fluids and mystical forces. A fever might be treated not with rest and fluids, but with bloodletting, literally draining blood from a vein, or with poultices made from ingredients like dung or crushed insects. Illnesses were often blamed on bad smells, curses, or divine punishment, and treatments could be just as hazardous as the diseases they sought to cure. Superstition seeped into every corner of medieval life. Many people firmly believed in witches, demons, and magical charms. A horseshoe nailed above a doorway wasn't decoration, it was spiritual armor against evil. Everyday occurrences, from a cat crossing a path to a dream about teeth falling out, were seen as omens, warnings from a universe where the line between the natural and the supernatural was dangerously thin. Food, too, reflected this mix of the strange and the practical. Medieval cuisine could be incredibly inventive. A banquet might feature pies filled with live birds, or elaborate dishes that combined animals into hybrid creations designed to amaze guests. Certain animals, like beavers, were classified as fish by church authorities, allowing them to be eaten during meatless fasting periods. In rural areas, simpler meals of bread, pottage, and ale formed the staple diet. But even these basics could be tinged at oddity, flavored with exotic spices when available, or fermented beyond modern tolerance levels. Social life revolved around community rituals, festivals, and seasonal celebrations. Some were solemn religious observances. Others, like the Feast of Fools, turned the world upside down for a day, placing clowns in bishops' robes and making mockery of sacred order. Weddings, funerals, and markets were not just practical necessities but also major social events, often filled with customs that blended reverence and revelry in ways that seem contradictory to modern sensibilities. Cleanliness and beauty were also far from what we might expect. Bathing was practiced more often than the myth of the dirty medieval peasant suggests, but it was limited by access to clean water and fuel for heating it. Public bathhouses served as social hubs, as well as hygiene centers, though they later earned scandalous reputations. Fashion ideals sometimes involved painful or dangerous practices, such as applying lead-based cosmetics to achieve the prized pale complexion, or removing hairlines with harsh chemicals to create the fashionable high forehead. The world outside city walls was no less peculiar. Travelers faced dangers not only from bandits but from superstition. Wayside crosses and roadside shrines dotted medieval Europe, serving as spiritual waypoints as well as landmarks. Pilgrims often wore badges or carried relics for protection, and it was not uncommon for travelers to seek refuge in monasteries, where hospitality was considered a sacred duty. Death was perhaps the most vivid reminder of the strange medieval mindset. The Black Death, which wiped out a third of Europe's population, left deep scars on the collective psyche. Funerary art often depicted corpses in various stages of decay, a constant reminder that life was fleeting and the afterlife uncertain. Memento mori, objects and images, reminding people of their mortality, were not morbid but moralistic, urging the living to prepare for judgment. In all these ways, medieval life was not a simple march of hardship and ignorance. It was a vivid, vibrant, and at times startlingly creative world. People adapted to the dangers and mysteries of their time with ingenuity, humor, and ritual. What may seem bizarre to modern minds was, for them, a logical response to a world where knowledge was limited, but imagination was boundless. In the chapters ahead, we will dive deeper into this strange medieval reality, from peculiar laws and brutal medicine to bizarre feasts, absurd jobs, and unforgettable festivals. We'll uncover how people lived, suffered, celebrated, and survived in one of history's most fascinating periods. Prepare to leave behind your modern assumptions. The Middle Ages were far weirder and far more human than you might ever have believed. Throughout medieval Europe, laws attempted to control not just crime but nearly every detail of daily life. It was a world where legislation extended into food, fashion, public behavior, and even leisure. For modern audiences, these laws often seem strange or absurd, yet in the medieval mindset, they represented efforts to maintain order, protect social hierarchies, and preserve moral standards in an unpredictable world. Sumptuary laws provide one of the clearest examples. These were rules that dictated what people could and could not wear, based on their social rank. In medieval England, for instance, only nobles of a certain status were permitted to wear garments made of silk, velvet, or adorned with gold thread. Bright colors, like deep purple or rich crimson, were reserved for the elite. If a commoner dared to dress above their station, they risked heavy fines, public shaming, or even confiscation of their clothing. The reasoning behind these regulations was partly moral, to discourage vanity and excess, but mostly political. By controlling appearances, authorities could reinforce the visible structure of society, making it immediately clear who belonged where. Fashion wasn't the only realm where legislation intervened. In several cities, laws were passed to limit the extravagance of meals. In 1336, England attempted to cap the number of courses that could be served at any one sitting to just 2, excluding soups and desserts. The intention was to curb gluttony and ostentatious displays of wealth, particularly among the rising merchant classes who threatened the traditional social order of the nobility. Public behavior was similarly regulated. In Venice, it was illegal to tell jokes about the government, a law that could earn a citizen a public flogging or exile. In France, laws were passed forbidding people from wearing masks or disguises outside of carnival season for fear that anonymity would lead to crime. Even spontaneous acts of joy could be seen as threats to public order. Dancing was banned in certain towns after outbreaks of mass dancing were linked to moral decline and suspected demonic possession. Perhaps even stranger were the laws surrounding sports and games. Football, a violent, unstructured mob game with few rules, was repeatedly banned across medieval England and Scotland. Kings like Edward II and Edward III issued proclamations forbidding the sport, not because it was dangerous, but because it distracted young men from practicing archery. Military readiness was paramount, and any leisure activity that interfered with it was treated as a serious societal risk. In some cases, fines for playing football were higher than those for minor thefts. Medieval lawmakers also tried to control more intimate behaviors. Public displays of affection, for instance, were often regulated. In 15th century London, could be fined or even briefly imprisoned. Public morality was a constant concern, and authorities sought to prevent scandalous behavior that could, in their view, corrode the fabric of society. Similarly, there were laws in certain German towns that prohibited women from wearing revealing necklines or unmarried women from wearing their hair uncovered. Markets were another heavily legislated space. Laws set strict standards for the quality and pricing of goods, especially essentials like bread and ale. The assize of bread and ale, first enacted in England in the 13th century, fixed the price of bread relative to the cost of wheat. Bakers who shortchanged customers by selling loaves lighter than the legal weight could be fined, publicly shamed in the pillory, or even subjected to corporal punishment. In fact, it's from this regulation that the term baker's dozen is thought to originate. To avoid accidentally short-selling a customer, bakers would give 13 items instead of 12. Beyond pricing and product quality, markets also imposed curious regulations on behavior. In some towns, it was illegal to shout excessively loud in the marketplace, both to prevent fights and to maintain an air of respectable commerce. Weighing scales had to be certified, and dishonest merchants risked losing their license to trade or facing the stocks. Even the arrangement of stalls was dictated by law, with certain streets reserved for specific trades, a practice that survives today in the names of places like Milk Street or Fish Lane. Public sanitation was another unexpected target of medieval legislation. In London, citizens were forbidden from dumping waste into the Thames River, a rule honoured more in the breach than the observance. People were also prohibited from throwing garbage into the streets or emptying chamber pots out of upper-story windows, at least during daylight hours. Nighttime, apparently, was considered a more acceptable time for such activities. Enforcement was sporadic at best, but the existence of these laws shows that medieval people were not entirely indifferent to public hygiene. Animal control also featured in medieval law codes. In cities, pigs were often banned from roaming freely because of the dangers they posed. Unattended pigs could root through refuse, spread disease, and even attack small children. In 1131, a pig in France was famously put on trial and executed for killing a child, a case so serious it was recorded by several chroniclers. Such events, bizarre as they seem, were treated with utmost seriousness at the time, reflecting a view of animals as legal subjects capable of guilt or innocence. Even light-hearted entertainments could be restricted. Street performers, including jugglers and minstrels, were sometimes banned from performing without a license, lest their shows cause crowds to gather and create opportunities for pickpockets or political agitation. Similarly, tournaments, the grand jousting events often associated with chivalry, were periodically banned or limited by royal decree because of their potential to cause real injuries and stir up rivalries among noble families. Across all these examples, one thing becomes clear: medieval authorities were deeply concerned with maintaining order, visibly displaying hierarchy, and preventing unrest. Every aspect of daily life, from what one wore, to how one celebrated, to what one said, was subject to oversight. To modern sensibilities, these laws can seem absurd or even petty, but within the context of a world where stability was fragile and society was rigidly hierarchical, these regulations made a certain sense. They were an attempt, however flawed, to control the uncontrollable. As we move forward, we will see that when formal laws failed, medieval societies often turned to more primitive methods of judgment, rituals of trial and ordeal that reveal just how deeply fear, faith, and superstition were woven into the fabric of justice. When formal laws and written codes were not enough, medieval societies often turned to older, more primal forms of justice, trial by ordeal. In a world where evidence was scarce and literacy rare, guilt and innocence were frequently left in the hands of divine forces. The idea was simple, if brutal. If God favored the accused, he would intervene and reveal the truth through physical signs. One of the most common ordeals was the ordeal of hot water. In this ritual, the accused would plunge a hand or arm into a cauldron of boiling water to retrieve a small object, such as a stone or ring placed at the bottom. The limb was then bandaged, and after 3 days, the bandages were removed. If the wound showed signs of clean healing, it was taken as a sign of innocence. If it festered or became infected, guilt was assumed. In some variations, the boiling water was replaced with burning metal. The accused might have to carry a red-hot iron bar over a set distance. Again, the state of the burns would determine their fate. In many cases, the process was as much a performance for the community as a judgment. Villagers, clergy, and officials gathered to witness the ordeal, reinforcing the shared belief that divine justice would not allow the innocent to suffer. Yet, by modern understanding, infection, burns, and wound healing have nothing to do with moral virtue. The system, while sincere in intent, was tragically flawed, often condemning the unlucky or the already weak. Another widespread ordeal was the trial by cold water, commonly associated with accusations of witchcraft. but used for other crimes as well. Here, the accused was bound and thrown into a body of water, typically a river or pond. If the person floated, they were considered guilty, their body allegedly rejecting the baptismal water as a sign of sin. If they sank, they were considered innocent, though the distinction was cold comfort to those who drowned before they could be rescued. In either outcome, the ordeal posed mortal risk. These rituals persisted for centuries, blending law, superstition, and communal pressure into a single terrifying event, even into the late medieval period. Despite the growing influence of more formal legal systems, ordeal-based trials continued, especially in rural communities far from centralized courts. Yet medieval legal thinking went even further into the strange, when it extended the concept of guilt and innocence beyond humans to the animal world. In medieval Europe, animals could and did face formal legal proceedings. Pigs, dogs, rats, goats, and even insects were summoned before courts, tried, and punished for various offenses. One of the most famous examples comes from Falaise, France in 1386, where a pig was charged with killing a child. The pig was given a full trial, complete with a legal defense, witnesses, and a judge. After being found guilty, the pig was dressed in human clothes, led to the town square, and hanged, a ritualistic execution meant to satisfy both divine and human justice. The dressing of the animal in clothes symbolized its moral personhood under the law, a bizarre but sincere attempt to apply human standards of guilt across species. Not all animal trials ended in execution. In some cases, animals were excommunicated by the church rather than physically punished. Rats accused of destroying crops were once summoned to court and given legal representation. When they failed to appear, understandably, their lawyer argued that the rats had legitimate fears for their safety due to the number of cats along the roadways. The absurdity of the argument did not prevent the court from proceeding, illustrating how deeply medieval society clung to ritual, even when reason might suggest otherwise. Insects, too, faced legal scrutiny. Locusts that ravaged vineyards were sometimes cursed by priests or excommunicated through formal ecclesiastical procedures. Bishops would read proclamations aloud, commanding the creatures to leave under threat of divine punishment. While this may seem comical today, it reflected a deeply held belief that moral order extended across all of creation. If humans were subject to divine and earthly law, so too were the beasts of the field and the pests of the air. These practices may strike modern observers as theatrical or delusional, but they served important functions in medieval communities. Trials and ordeals reinforced the shared moral universe in which medieval people lived. Justice was not simply about facts or proof, it was about aligning the human world with a divine order. Suffering an ordeal proved more than guilt or innocence. It reaffirmed the belief that the cosmos itself intervened in human affairs. Moreover, in a time when institutions were fragile and local justice systems varied widely, these rituals provided a form of public resolution. The community watched justice unfold together, with visible consequences. The spectacle, however cruel or illogical by today's standards, bound people to each other and to their collective understanding of right and wrong. As the Middle Ages progressed, particularly after the 13th century, reliance on ordeals began to wane. The Church, increasingly skeptical of ordeal trials, prohibited clergy from participating in them after the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215. In response, more emphasis was placed on evidence, testimony, and written records. Secular courts grew more sophisticated, moving toward recognizable forms of trial by jury. Nonetheless, the memory and occasional use of ordeal lingered in rural communities well into the late medieval and early modern periods. Similarly, animal trials, though they declined, left a cultural imprint. Tales of pigs in court and rats, excommunicated, became part of the broader folklore, both mocking and preserving a memory of a time when humanity sought order in ways that today seem fantastical. As we leave the grim and often surreal world of trials and ordeals behind, we next turn to another domain where medieval justice showed its most brutal side. The punishments meted out to the guilty, stocks, whipping posts, ducking stools, and cruel devices of torture all played a role in maintaining order. Their use reveals not just the harshness of medieval justice, but the deep fear of disorder that haunted medieval society. Punishment in the Middle Ages was not simply about deterring crime, it was about public spectacle, social control, and in many cases, making an example so memorable that others would think twice before stepping out of line. Medieval punishments often appear brutal to modern sensibilities, but they were carefully designed within the cultural values of the time, emphasizing shame, deterrence, and divine retribution. One of the most common forms of punishment for minor crimes was the use of the stocks or pillory. The stocks typically restrained the feet, while the pillory clamped the head and hands, forcing the offender into a painfully awkward position in a public square. There, the individual would remain on display, often for hours or even days, subject to the ridicule, insults, and sometimes missiles, rotten vegetables, stones, and worse, from passers-by. Far from being an afterthought, this humiliation was central to the punishment. In a society that prized public reputation, a day in the stocks could be devastating to a person's standing in the community. More specialized punishments existed for particular crimes. The scold's bridle, for example, was a gruesome device intended primarily for women accused of gossiping, nagging, or spreading rumors. Behaviors seen as disruptive to social harmony. The bridle was an iron framework fitted around the head, often with a metal plate or spike inserted into the mouth to press down on the tongue. The wearer was paraded through the town or chained to a public post, silenced both physically and socially. It was not only a method of punishment, but also a chilling reminder to others to guard their speech carefully. For those convicted of more serious offenses, punishments grew harsher. Public flogging was widespread, used to discipline thieves, adulterers, and other offenders. The whip was often wielded by officials in full view of the community, emphasizing the power of law over the individual. In some towns, the number of lashes corresponded to the severity of the crime, and records show instances where convicts received dozens, even hundreds, of strokes. Ducking stools presented another inventive form of public humiliation, particularly for women accused of being disorderly or disruptive. The accused was strapped into a chair mounted on a long lever and dunked repeatedly into a body of water, usually a river or pond. Besides the physical discomfort and danger of drowning, the primary aim was humiliation, a baptism of shame, reinforcing communal norms about acceptable behavior. More severe punishments could involve mutilation. Thieves might have a hand cut off as both punishment and permanent reminder of their crime. Forgers could lose fingers or be branded on the forehead. Branding was also used for vagrants and repeat offenders, with hot irons searing letters into the skin, T for thief, for example. These punishments served as lifelong markers of disgrace, visible to all. Execution, naturally, represented the ultimate penalty. Hanging was the most common method across medieval Europe for crimes like murder, robbery, or treason. The condemned would be paraded to the gallows, often located just outside city walls, where large crowds gathered to witness the final act of justice. Public executions were events in themselves, not morbid sideshows, but civic rituals that reaffirmed the power of the authorities and the moral order of society. Other execution methods could be even more dramatic. In certain cases of high treason, the punishment in England involved hanging, drawing, and quartering. The convicted man was dragged to the place of execution on a hurdle, hanged almost to the point of death, then disemboweled, beheaded, and cut into quarters. Though this gruesome penalty was reserved for the most serious crimes against the king or state, it reflected the medieval belief that treachery against the ruler was treachery against the divine order itself. Torture, though less commonly used than popular imagination suggests, did play a role in extracting confessions or punishing the accused, especially in high-profile cases. The rack, one of the most infamous torture devices, stretched a prisoner's body until joints dislocated and muscles tore. Another instrument, the thumbscrew, crushed the digits slowly and painfully. The Iron Maiden, often imagined today as a spiked sarcophagus, likely owes more to later myth than medieval reality. But other cruel devices, like the strappado, where a victim was hoisted by the arms and dropped suddenly to dislocate the shoulders, were genuinely used. It's important to recognize that medieval punishment was not random cruelty. It operated within a framework of deeply held beliefs about sin, morality, and communal responsibility. Pain and humiliation were seen as necessary means to achieve repentance, and to deter others from falling into similar crimes. In many cases, the public nature of the punishment mattered as much as the suffering itself. By witnessing the fate of a wrongdoer, the community was reminded of its shared values and of the consequences of transgression. Still, some punishments reflect the more unsettling edges of medieval thought. Animals, as discussed earlier, could be tried and executed. But in rare instances, inanimate objects could be subjected to judgment as well. There are records of excommunications issued against plagues of insects or curses laid upon weapons that had been used in murder. In one unusual case, a murderer's house was ordered to be torn down stone by stone, the site left barren as a form of atonement. Gradually, by the later Middle Ages, legal practices began to shift. More formal court procedures, including the use of evidence and witness testimony, started to replace the reliance on physical punishments and public shaming. However, the legacy of medieval justice, with its vivid emphasis on public morality, divine judgment, and the spectacle of correction, would leave a lasting impression on European culture for centuries. As we step away from the spectacle of punishment, our exploration now moves into an even stranger domain, the medieval approach to medicine. In a world without germ theory or modern hygiene, treatments for illness were often as dangerous as the diseases themselves, a grim reality we will explore next. Leaving behind the brutal world of medieval punishment, we enter another realm where misunderstanding and fear often shaped human experience, the world of medieval medicine. In an age before the discovery of bacteria, viruses, or even basic principles of hygiene, attempts to cure the sick were based on a blend of ancient theory, superstition, religious belief, and desperate improvisation. Medicine, though practiced with serious intent, often caused more harm than healing. At the heart of medieval medical theory lay the concept of the four humours, developed from ancient Greek writings, particularly those of Hippocrates and later Galen. This theory taught that the human body was governed by four bodily fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health depended on keeping these humours in balance. Illness, therefore, was not caused by germs or environmental factors, but by an excess or deficiency of one or more humours. Each humour was associated with particular seasons, temperaments, and elements. Blood was linked to air and springtime, phlegm to water and winter, yellow bile to fire and summer, and black bile to earth and autumn. A cheerful personality was thought to result from an abundance of blood, while a melancholic temperament arose from too much black bile. The theory neatly connected physical and emotional health in a single framework, offering a comprehensive if entirely incorrect view of human biology. When a person fell ill, the medieval physician's first task was to determine which humour was out of balance. Diagnosis often involved examining urine, not through laboratory tests but through sight, smell, and even taste. Physicians would inspect the color and clarity of urine, believing it revealed the inner state of the body. Charts comparing different shades of urine with corresponding illnesses were common tools of the trade. Once a diagnosis was made, treatment aimed to restore the lost balance. Bloodletting was one of the most common methods. Physicians or barber surgeons would open a vein with a sharp blade, or use leeches to draw blood from the patient. The idea was simple: if the body had too much blood, thought to cause fevers, headaches, or even anger, removing some would restore harmony. Unfortunately, excessive blood loss often weakened patients further, and in cases of severe illness, it could hasten death rather than recovery. Other treatments were equally hazardous. Vomiting was sometimes induced to clear excess bile, and purgatives, herbal concoctions designed to cause violent diarrhea, were administered to cleanse the body. Hot cups, created by placing heated glass vessels against the skin to draw blood to the surface, were another common remedy. While some of these treatments had minor therapeutic effects, many were painful, debilitating, or outright dangerous. Diet and environment also played crucial roles in medieval medicine. Physicians prescribed specific foods to correct humor imbalances. For instance, someone with too much phlegm might be advised to eat hot, dry foods like roasted meats and spices, while a patient suffering from an excess of yellow bile might be recommended cooling foods like cucumbers or dairy products. Fresh air, cleanliness, and moderation were encouraged, though the medieval understanding of cleanliness was different from ours. Bathing, when possible, was seen as healthful, but stagnant or corrupted air was feared more than dirty water. Religious belief was intertwined with medical practice. Illness was often seen as a punishment for sin or a test of faith. Prayer, pilgrimage, and offerings to saints were common adjuncts to physical treatments. Some physicians combined medical practice with astrological readings, believing that the position of the stars and planets could influence health. A treatment might be scheduled according to lunar phases, with certain days considered auspicious or dangerous for surgery. Despite the limitations of medieval medicine, some treatments did have genuine, if accidental, benefits. Herbal remedies such as willow bark, containing salicylic acid, the basis of aspirin, provided real relief from pain. Honey, widely used for wound care, has natural antibacterial properties, but these practical successes were often overshadowed by dangerous methods rooted in misunderstanding. Surgical practice, where it existed, was even riskier. Without anesthesia or antiseptics, even minor operations carried significant risk of infection and death. Surgery was typically the domain of barber surgeons, a distinct profession from physicians, who were often trained through apprenticeships rather than formal education. Trepanation, drilling a hole into the skull to relieve pressure, was practiced well into the medieval period. Surprisingly, archaeological evidence shows that some patients survived this brutal procedure, though the reasons and techniques varied widely. Plague outbreaks, like the Black Death of the 14th century, brought the inadequacies of medieval medicine into stark relief. Facing a disease they could neither understand nor cure, physicians resorted to desperate measures. Plague doctors, clad in their iconic bird-beaked masks, stuffed with aromatic herbs, attempted to filter the bad air, thought to spread the disease. Treatments ranged from lancing and draining buboes, to burning aromatic woods, to applying bizarre poultices made from onions, vinegar, or even crushed emeralds. In rural areas, where professional medical help was rare or non-existent, people turned to local healers, midwives, and wise women. Folk medicine included the use of charms, potions, and rituals, blending practical herbal knowledge with magical thinking. While often dismissed by official authorities, these practitioners sometimes provided more compassionate and occasionally more effective care than formally trained physicians. Looking back, it's easy to view medieval medicine as a dangerous mixture of guesswork and superstition. Yet within their limited understanding, medieval doctors were genuinely attempting to heal. They worked within a framework that made sense in its time, drawing on ancient authorities, religious beliefs, and observation. Their failures reflect not stupidity or cruelty, but the limitations of knowledge in a world before microscopes, antibiotics, and modern science. As we move deeper into the strangeness of medieval life, we'll soon see that medicine's oddities were not confined to theory. Treatments for some of history's deadliest diseases, like the Black Death, reveal the extremes to which medieval societies would go in their quest to survive. Among the many peculiar practices of medieval medicine, 3 treatments stand out for their ubiquity, their symbolic significance, and their often questionable results: bloodletting, leech therapy, and urine analysis. These methods were not fringe techniques, but standard practices recommended by physicians across Europe. They reveal a world where the boundaries between science, superstition, and ritual blurred into a single understanding of health and disease. Bloodletting, perhaps the most iconic medieval treatment, was based on the belief that illness stemmed from an imbalance of the body's humors. If there was too much blood, thought to cause fevers, headaches, or inflammations, the solution seemed obvious: remove some of it. Physicians and barber surgeons alike would perform bloodletting, often by opening a vein with a sharp blade, allowing blood to flow freely into a bowl. The amount of blood to be removed varied depending on the diagnosis, the patient's physical condition, the season, and even the phase of the moon. Detailed charts existed, specifying which veins should be opened for specific illnesses. For example, if a patient suffered from liver problems, blood might be drawn from the right arm. Heart troubles called for bleeding from the chest veins. Even the astrological sign under which a person was born could influence the choice of site and timing. Despite its popularity, bloodletting was risky. Excessive blood loss weakened patients, making recovery from illness harder rather than easier. Yet the practice persisted because it fit neatly into the prevailing theory of humors and because it offered a visible, dramatic intervention. a tangible effort to correct an unseen imbalance. In many cases, leeches offered an alternative to manual bloodletting. These aquatic parasites, carefully collected from rivers and marshes, were prized for their ability to draw blood in a more controlled, less invasive manner. Physicians would apply leeches to specific points on the body, particularly areas considered congested with excess blood, such as swollen joints or inflamed wounds. The use of leeches was not without its hazards. An unsupervised leech could migrate to sensitive internal areas, and improper removal risked severe bleeding or infection. Nevertheless, leeches were widely valued. Apothecaries sold them in jars, and wealthy patients often kept their own supply on hand. In some cases, the application of leeches may have had modest benefits, particularly in relieving localized pressure or inflammation. But more often, the therapy was a symbolic gesture, reinforcing the idea that visible intervention could set right an invisible wrong. Perhaps even more peculiar to modern minds was the medieval obsession with urine analysis. Known as uroscopy, the examination of urine was a central diagnostic tool. Sometimes elevated to an art form, physicians would collect a sample of the patient's urine in a glass flask, called a macula, and study its color, clarity, smell, and even taste. Urine was believed to reflect the body's inner workings with uncanny precision. A pale, watery urine suggested coldness and excess phlegm. Dark, thick urine indicated heat and an overabundance of bile. Cloudiness might point to kidney troubles, or an imbalance of humors. Physicians often used detailed uroscopy charts, displaying dozens of shades and their corresponding illnesses. Medical manuals advised practitioners to observe urine in natural light, ideally in the morning, to achieve the most accurate readings. Some physicians went further, swirling the urine to observe sediment patterns, or even heating it to see how it reacted. In certain cases, doctors were known to taste a drop, believing the flavor could reveal hidden ailments, a practice that requires more bravery than modern medicine generally demands. While urine analysis was deeply flawed as a diagnostic method, it did encourage physicians to pay close attention to bodily signs. In an era before laboratory testing, it represented one of the few non-invasive ways to gather information about a patient's internal condition. Though the conclusions drawn were often misguided, the process at least acknowledged that illnesses manifested through physical changes. The importance placed on urine extended into popular culture. Some medieval cities employed official water tasters or water doctors, individuals specializing solely in uroscopy. These practitioners might be consulted at market fairs, alongside apothecaries and traveling healers, offering quick diagnoses based on little more than a glance into a flask. For all its peculiarities, medieval medicine was not static. Over time, critiques of practices like bloodletting and urine analysis emerged. Some physicians began to question the benefits of repeated blood loss, particularly for patients already weakened by disease. By the late Middle Ages, more cautious approaches to bloodletting were advocated in medical texts, though the practice would not truly fall out of favor until the early modern period. Similarly, the precision of uroscopy declined as medical understanding improved. Observations of pulse, temperature, and symptoms began to supplant reliance on urine alone. Still, the deep symbolism of these practices lingered, reflecting a society desperate for methods to understand and influence the mysterious processes of illness and recovery. It is tempting to dismiss bloodletting, leech therapy, and urine tasting as barbaric or foolish. But to the medieval mind, they were logical extensions of a coherent theory of health. In a world where diseases struck suddenly and invisibly, these rituals provided not only physical intervention, but psychological reassurance. They offered patients and practitioners alike the comforting illusion of control in a deeply unpredictable world. As we delve deeper into medieval approaches to illness, we encounter the era's ultimate challenge, plague. The Black Death, sweeping across Europe with unimaginable speed and ferocity, exposed the limits of every medical practice, from bloodletting to holy relics. In the face of catastrophe, medieval society turned to ever stranger and more desperate measures, a story we will explore next. When the Black Death struck Europe in the mid-14th century, it exposed the brutal limits of medieval medicine. Diseases before had been feared, but the plague was different, overwhelming in its speed, ferocity, and sheer scale. Arriving in Europe around 1347, the Black Death swept across the continent, killing an estimated 1/3 to 1/2 of the population within just a few years. Cities emptied almost overnight, villages disappeared, and entire communities were left traumatized. In response, medieval society turned to every imaginable cure, no matter how desperate, dangerous, or bizarre. At the time, no one understood the true cause of the plague, which we now know was primarily spread by fleas on rats, with pneumonic transmission between people also possible. Medieval explanations varied wildly. Some blamed poisoned wells, accusing marginalized groups like Jewish communities, often with horrific consequences. Others believed the disease was carried by bad air, known as miasma. Still others thought it was a punishment from God, sent to chastise humanity for its sins. In the face of such terror, treatments ranged from the mildly helpful to the actively harmful. One common method was to purify the air. Townspeople burned large fires of aromatic herbs, such as rosemary, juniper, and frankincense, hoping to cleanse the atmosphere. In richer areas, individuals carried small posies of flowers or bundles of sweet-smelling herbs to hold under their noses. This is the likely origin of the children's rhyme Ring a Ring a Roses, a haunting relic of plague culture, though its direct connection is debated. Doctors developed the now iconic plague doctor outfit, a heavy cloak, gloves, boots, and most famously, a bird-like mask with glass eye openings and a long curved beak. The beak was stuffed with herbs and spices, intended to filter the corrupt air. While the outfit offered little real protection against infection, it provided a psychological barrier, both for the physician and the patient, a visible symbol of an attempt to fight the invisible enemy. Another widely practiced cure was bloodletting, a trusted standby of medieval medicine. Patients suffering from plague symptoms were often subjected to leech therapy or the opening of veins. The thinking remained the same. The disease must be the result of humoral imbalance, and by removing excess blood, the body's natural order might be restored. Unfortunately, bloodletting often left patients too weak to recover from the already devastating infection. Equally desperate were the poultices and topical treatments applied to buboes, the swollen lymph nodes that characterize the bubonic form of the plague. One popular remedy involved slicing open the buboes to drain them, followed by applying a paste made from a mixture of tree resins, flower petals, and crushed onions. Other recipes were more aggressive. Compounds made from human waste, crushed insects, or snake flesh were pressed into wounds, in the hope that the infection could be drawn out through sympathetic magic. Some believed that plague could be avoided by maintaining bodily balance through purgatives and emetics. Patients were given strong laxatives to cleanse the body from within, leading to severe dehydration and further weakening. Vinegar was also a common ingredient in supposed cures. People bathed in vinegar, drank vinegar mixtures, or doused infected areas in vinegar and rosewater. One legend speaks of the Four Thieves vinegar, a mixture of vinegar infused with garlic, lavender, sage, and other herbs. Supposedly, a band of thieves used this potion to protect themselves while robbing the homes of plague victims, though the story is likely more folklore than fact. Religious responses to the plague were equally dramatic. In some areas, groups known as flagellants marched from town to town, whipping themselves in public displays of penance. They believed that by punishing their own bodies, they could atone for humanity's sins and halt the plague. These processions sometimes spiraled into chaos, with flagellants attacking perceived sinners and spreading fear rather than relief. Church authorities, worried by the disorder and heretical elements among flagellant groups, eventually moved to suppress them. More traditional religious responses included masses, processions, and prayers dedicated to particular saints associated with healing, such as Saint Sebastian and Saint Roch. In desperate regions, cities held public ceremonies where citizens marched barefoot, chanting prayers for mercy. Some communities even staged elaborate rituals designed to drive out the plague, such as marching livestock through the streets or burying symbolic effigies. In addition to prayers and processions, plague survivors often commissioned works of art and architecture as acts of gratitude or supplication. Many churches built chapels dedicated to plague saints, while paintings and altarpieces depicted grim scenes of death and resurrection. The theme of Danse Macabre, or the Dance of Death, became a popular motif, reminding everyone, noble or peasant, that death spared no one. Despite these efforts, the Black Death returned in waves throughout the late Middle Ages. Successive outbreaks periodically devastated towns and reshaped society. Labor shortages following the initial plague led to rising wages for peasants and contributed to the eventual decline of the feudal system. Psychological scars ran deep. The memory of the plague influenced literature, art, and even religious practices for generations. Looking back, it is easy to view the plague cures of the Middle Ages with a sense of tragic irony. The burning herbs, the aromatic beaks, the draining of bobos. None could stop a disease that moved silently and mercilessly through communities. Yet these efforts reflected a profound human resilience. In a time without scientific understanding, people still fought back with the tools they had: ritual, hope, and ingenuity. The Black Death stands as one of history's most devastating events, but it also marked a turning point. Medicine would slowly begin to shift toward more empirical methods. Observation, rather than inherited dogma, would gradually take precedence, setting the stage for later advances. But before that transformation could happen, medieval society would continue to battle disease with every means available, including faith, folklore, and the occasional clove of garlic. As we leave behind the dark shadows of the plague, our journey next leads to another critical part of medieval healthcare: hospitals, battlefield surgery, and the often brutal attempts to save lives when survival hung by a thread. While the plague revealed the limits of medieval medicine, everyday illnesses, injuries, and battlefield wounds also demanded constant care. Hospitals, surgery, and emergency treatments in the Middle Ages offer a revealing glimpse into a world where healing was often a mixture of devotion, bravery, and improvisation. Though crude by modern standards, medieval healthcare was built on its own logic and operated with the tools and knowledge available at the time. Medieval hospitals were not hospitals in the modern sense. Rather than places primarily for curing diseases, they served as shelters for the sick, the poor, the elderly, and pilgrims. Most were run by religious institutions, monasteries, convents, or church-funded orders, and emphasized charity over medical intervention. Caregivers were often monks or nuns, who saw tending the sick as a form of service to God. Hospitals provided food, basic nursing, and clean beds, critical comforts in a world where most homes lacked even simple luxuries like spare linen or consistent meals. Cleanliness, while understood differently, was emphasized within hospital walls. Bathing patients, airing out rooms, and laundering sheets were part of routine care, based on the belief that foul odors and corrupted air caused disease. Spiritual health was considered as important as physical recovery, so hospitals typically included chapels, where patients could confess, receive communion, and prepare for death if healing proved impossible. Treatment varied based on the institution. Some hospitals employed trained physicians or barber surgeons, particularly in larger towns or near universities. Others relied solely on the practical experience of religious caregivers. Remedies included herbal medicines, dietary adjustments, and for surgical patients, rudimentary operations performed without anesthesia. Surgery in the medieval period was a risky proposition. Without knowledge of germ theory and lacking antiseptics, surgeons often operated in conditions ripe for infection. Nevertheless, surgery was surprisingly common. Barber surgeons, so called because they also performed haircuts and shaving, handled tasks like wound stitching, broken bone setting, and even basic amputations. One of the more sophisticated procedures was the treatment of fractures. Medieval surgical manuals described techniques for aligning broken bones and creating splints using wood, linen bandages, and wax. Trepanation, drilling a hole into the skull to relieve pressure after head trauma, was another operation known since ancient times and practiced cautiously. Archaeological evidence suggests that a significant number of trepaned skulls show signs of healing, indicating that patients sometimes survived the ordeal. Battlefield surgery brought an even harsher reality. Knights clad in armor were vulnerable to crushing blows, arrow wounds, and blunt trauma. Surgeons attached to military campaigns faced grim tasks, amputating limbs shattered by weapons, removing embedded arrows, and trying to prevent fatal infections. One common technique involved cauterization, burning a wound with a red-hot iron to seal blood vessels and supposedly prevent infection. The agony was indescribable, but in an era without pain relief, it was often the only way to save a life. Arrow wounds presented particular challenges. Medieval arrows, often barbed, were designed to cause maximum internal damage. Extracting them required specialized tools like forceps or hollow steel tubes that could be slipped over the barbs before withdrawal. Some treatises recommend enlarging the wound with a knife if necessary to safely remove the arrow, a horrifying but sometimes life-saving procedure. Anesthesia, as we understand it today, did not exist. However, medieval practitioners experimented with herbal sedatives to dull pain. Mixtures known as dwelly were brewed from ingredients like henbane, hemlock, opium poppy, and mandrake root. These potions could cause unconsciousness, though the dosage was precarious. Too little, and the patient remained awake during surgery. Too much, and the patient might never wake up at all. Post-operative care was minimal by modern standards. Wounds were often dressed with poultices made from honey, vinegar, or wine, substances that, though understood mystically, did offer some antibacterial benefits. Despite the risks, successful surgeries did occur, especially when patients were young, strong, and lucky enough to avoid deadly infections. Aside from battlefield wounds, everyday injuries also demanded attention. Farmers suffered broken bones, burns, and lacerations. Artisans cut themselves on tools or strained muscles. Bone setters, often working outside the formal medical system, specialized in realigning fractures and treating sprains. Their methods were rough, but a skilled bone setter could sometimes achieve better results than a surgeon, simply through experience and instinct. For illnesses deemed untreatable, hospitals and caregivers focused on providing comfort. Broths, herbal teas, prayers, and simple cleanliness formed the backbone of palliative care. In many ways, this humble, compassionate approach sometimes achieved better outcomes than aggressive medical interventions, especially given the dangers of bleeding, purging, or surgery. The training of medical practitioners varied widely. Some physicians attended emerging universities, studying ancient texts like those of Galen and Hippocrates, supplemented by Arabic medical knowledge from scholars like Avicenna. Barber surgeons learned through apprenticeships, mastering their craft through observation and hands-on practice, rather than formal schooling. Apothecaries, who prepared medicines, occupied yet another professional niche, blending botanical knowledge with folk remedies. Licensing and regulation were inconsistent. In some cities, physicians had to pass examinations or be approved by guilds. In rural areas, anyone with a reputation for healing might find work, regardless of formal credentials. This patchwork of care providers reflected the decentralized nature of medieval society itself, a world of local customs, limited central authority, and a blend of faith and pragmatism. While the medieval medical system was riddled with dangers and misunderstandings, it also showed remarkable resilience and creativity. Within the limits of their knowledge, medieval caregivers adapted ancient theories, practical experience, and spiritual traditions into a functioning, if fragile, healthcare network. For many, a hospital bed, a clean bandage, or a kind word from a nurse offered not just physical aid, but a measure of dignity in the face of suffering. As we move beyond the wards and battlefields, we find that medicine was only part of medieval society's response to illness. Alongside scalpels and poultices, people turned to magic, charms, and relics in their search for healing. In the next chapter, we explore the strange world of magical cures and the curious power of faith in the medieval imagination. In a world where medicine could offer little certainty, medieval people often turned to magic and faith to seek healing. Alongside surgeries and herbal remedies, the sick and desperate pursued cures involving charms, relics, sacred rituals, and mythical substances. To them, magic and religion were not opposing forces, but intertwined paths towards survival. One of the most exotic and highly prized healing substances of the Middle Ages was unicorn horn. Of course, no actual unicorns ever roamed medieval Europe. What passed as unicorn horn was typically the long, spiral tusk of the narwhal, an Arctic whale unknown to most Europeans. These tusks were imported through complex trade routes and sold at exorbitant prices, sometimes worth several times their weight in gold. Unicorn horn was believed to have powerful healing properties. It could supposedly detect poison, cure fevers, and neutralize diseases. Wealthy rulers and churches often displayed unicorn drinking horns, sometimes embedded with jewels, believing that any liquid poured into such a vessel would become safe to drink. Powdered unicorn horn was administered to the sick, sprinkled over wounds, or carried as a protective talisman. Even kings and popes were not above relying on these precious relics, blending myth into everyday healthcare. Relics of saints offered another avenue for healing. The bones, clothing, or even simple items touched by revered saints were thought to possess miraculous powers. Pilgrims traveled great distances to touch or even glimpse these relics, hoping for cures. Cathedrals vied to acquire the most impressive relics, believing that housing them would draw pilgrims and the donations they brought. In some cases, relics were tiny fragments, a finger bone, a splinter from the true cross, or a scrap of cloth worn by a martyr. Other relics could be grander, entire skulls, arms, or even hearts preserved in ornate reliquaries. These objects were often paraded through towns during times of plague or disaster, in the belief that their presence could ward off illness. Relics were not just passive symbols, they were thought to actively engage with the faithful. Stories abounded of relics healing the blind, curing leprosy, restoring the paralyzed, and even reviving the dead, though skepticism occasionally appeared among intellectuals. For the majority, relics represented a living link to the divine. Charms and amulets also played a major role in personal healthcare. People wore small pendants inscribed with prayers, symbols, or the names of saints. Some charms incorporated gemstones, believed to have specific healing powers. Sapphires were thought to cure eye diseases, emeralds to ward off epilepsy, and coral to protect against bleeding. Not all charms were overtly religious. Folk magic often crept in, blending pagan traditions with Christian beliefs. Herbs tied in bundles, words spoken at specific times, or secret marks drawn on the skin, were all believed to influence health. Love charms, fertility spells, and protective talismans were part of everyday life, particularly in rural areas where formal medical help was scarce. Another curious belief involved holy wells and springs. Across Britain, Ireland, and parts of continental Europe, certain bodies of water were revered as sources of healing. Pilgrims would travel to these sites, drink the water, bathe in it, or leave offerings, such as coins, cloth, or pins. Often these wells were later associated with Christian saints, though many likely had pre-Christian origins. Their persistence into the medieval period shows how deeply rooted the need for tangible, mystical healing was. Exorcism was another route toward curing disease, particularly when illness was believed to result from demonic possession. Church rituals involving prayers, holy water, and the laying on of hands sought to expel the invading spirits. While some exorcisms focused on obvious signs like fits or strange behavior, milder forms could be invoked for fevers, melancholy, or persistent bad luck. Astrology also played a role in medieval healing. Physicians often consulted star charts before diagnosing or treating patients. It was believed that celestial alignments influenced bodily health. Specific organs corresponded to different zodiac signs. Aries ruled the head, Taurus the neck, and so forth. Treatments were scheduled according to planetary movements, with certain days deemed more favorable for bleeding, purging, or administering medicines. One example of astrological medicine involved bloodletting charts, circular diagrams, advising the best times to let blood depending on the moon's phase and the patient's astrological sign. While it may seem illogical today, astrology provided a framework for understanding the unpredictable and often terrifying world of disease. Miracle cures also found their place in medieval lore. Tales abounded of sudden, inexplicable recoveries at holy shrines. One might read of a blind woman regaining her sight after touching the tomb of a saint, or a crippled man walking again after drinking from a sacred spring. These stories spread by word of mouth, written chronicles and religious sermons, reinforcing the hope that healing was always possible, if not through medicine, then through divine mercy. Some of these miracle stories were carefully documented by church officials, particularly when considering candidates for sainthood. Detailed inquiries gathered testimonies about healings, often including multiple witnesses and physicians' attestations. In this way, the medieval church validated and institutionalized the idea that healing was as much a spiritual event as a physical one. Of course, Not every supposed cure was successful. Many pilgrims left shrines still afflicted, many amulet-bearers succumbed to disease, and many prayers went unanswered. Yet the pursuit of magical and religious healing reflects a deep universal human impulse, the refusal to surrender to suffering without a fight, and the hope that unseen forces might intervene where human hands failed. As we leave behind the shimmering world of unicorn horns, healing springs, and sacred relics, we turn next to another fundamental part of medieval life: hygiene. How did people keep themselves and their cities clean in a world without running water, sanitation systems, or germ theory? The answers are more surprising than the myths suggest. Popular imagination often paints the Middle Ages as a time of overwhelming filth, with people refusing to bathe and cities wallowing in waste. While it's true that medieval standards of hygiene differed from modern ones, the reality was far more complex and far cleaner than many believe. People in the Middle Ages understood the importance of cleanliness, even if they lacked the scientific knowledge to fully explain its role in preventing disease. Bathing was a regular part of life for many medieval Europeans, especially during the early and high medieval periods. Public bathhouses operated in most major towns and cities, providing places where people of various classes could pay to wash, socialize, and sometimes relax in communal hot baths. These establishments ranged from modest wooden structures to elaborate bath complexes with multiple pools, heated rooms, and private alcoves. Bathing habits varied by region and era. In warmer climates and wealthier areas, it was common for individuals to bathe weekly, or even more often. Bathing was associated not just with personal cleanliness, but with health, relaxation, and spiritual well-being. Medical texts of the time often recommended regular baths to balance the humors, improve digestion, and soothe the mind. Hot baths were seen as a luxury, but cold water plunges were also used to invigorate the body. At home, people washed their faces, hands, and feet daily, using basins and cloths. Washing before meals and after using the toilet, usually a chamber pot, was encouraged by etiquette manuals and religious teachings alike. Even peasants living in rural areas made efforts to stay clean, though access to large amounts of clean water could be more difficult. Soap was available and widely used, though it differed from the heavily perfumed and chemical-laden soaps we know today. Early medieval soap was often made from a combination of animal fats and wood ash. In places like Castile in Spain, high-quality soaps based on olive oil were produced and exported across Europe. Soap makers even organized into guilds in some cities, reflecting the importance of their trade. However, hygiene practices began to decline somewhat in the late Middle Ages, particularly after the devastation of the Black Death. Fears that water opened the pores to dangerous bad air, miasma, led some people to reduce the frequency of bathing. This was compounded by the decline of public bathhouses, some of which were increasingly associated with immoral behavior, as brothels began operating under the same roofs. By the 15th century, authorities in some cities began shutting down public baths for reasons of morality and public health. To compensate, dry hygiene methods grew more common. People used linen undergarments, which absorbed sweat and dirt, and which were changed and washed frequently. In fact, owning several clean changes of linen was considered a sign of good breeding and respectability. Wealthy individuals might change shirts and shifts daily, using these garments as a form of body care when frequent bathing was impractical. Teeth cleaning also had a place in medieval hygiene routines. People used cloths, frayed twigs, or rudimentary toothbrushes to scrub their teeth. Powders made from crushed herbs, salt, or even burnt bread were employed to clean and whiten teeth. Breath-freshening pastes and mouthwashes were sometimes prepared from spices like cinnamon and cloves. Manuscripts even survive, offering recipes for pleasant-smelling breath, showing that personal grooming mattered even in times of scarce resources. Hair care was another essential aspect of hygiene. Combs, made from wood, bone, or horn, were widely used and have been found in archaeological sites across Europe. People regularly combed their hair to remove dirt and lice, a common problem in all classes of society. Oiling and perfuming hair were popular among the wealthy, with rosewater, lavender, and other scents favored for their refreshing qualities. Public sanitation, however, posed greater challenges. Medieval towns and cities were densely packed, with narrow streets and limited infrastructure for waste removal. Open sewers, known as kennels, ran down the middle of streets, carrying away rainwater and human refuse. Regulations existed requiring householders to keep the area in front of their homes clean, but enforcement was inconsistent at best. Public latrines were built in some areas, often located near rivers or other bodies of water for easy flushing. Monasteries and castles had relatively sophisticated toilet systems, including stone-built latrines known as garderobes, which discharge waste into pits or moats. In wealthier homes, chamber pots were common and discreetly emptied by servants. Despite efforts at cleanliness, cities still suffered from foul smells and outbreaks of disease, particularly during hot summers. Urban authorities sometimes organized large-scale cleanups, hiring workers to remove waste and spread rushes or herbs on filthy streets to mask odors. Seasonal regulations prohibited butchering animals within city limits during warm months. To reduce contamination, water supply also played a crucial role. Many towns built aqueducts or dug wells to provide fresh water, and some cities installed public fountains where citizens could collect clean drinking water. Wealthier homes might have private wells, while monasteries and castles often constructed elaborate water management systems to supply kitchens, gardens, and baths. While medieval people lacked modern sanitation technology, their understanding of hygiene was not non-existent. They recognized that cleanliness contributed to health, even if their explanations leaned heavily on humoral theory or religious doctrine. Washing hands before meals, keeping the home tidy, avoiding foul smells, and maintaining personal grooming were all seen as marks of civility and godliness. It is worth noting that medieval standards of hygiene often compared favorably with those in later centuries. In fact, during parts of the early modern period, bathing fell further out of favor than it had in medieval times, as fears about water and disease grew stronger. Ironically, medieval Europeans may have been, in some respects, cleaner than their descendants in the Renaissance and beyond. As we move forward, we will explore another side of medieval self-care, the often elaborate and sometimes bizarre beauty practices that people pursued in their quest to achieve society's ideals of appearance. Cleanliness was only part of personal care in the medieval world. Beauty and grooming played a significant role in medieval society, especially among the wealthy. Just as today's cultures promote particular standards of appearance, medieval Europe had its own ideals, and people went to great lengths, and sometimes painful extremes, to meet them. Fair, pale skin was the ultimate mark of beauty for both men and women. Pale skin signified nobility, as it indicated a life spent indoors away from the sun and the hard labor of the fields. To achieve this look, people used a variety of cosmetic methods, many of them hazardous. Women applied mixtures made from lead carbonate, a toxic white substance, to lighten their faces. While effective at producing the desired pallor, repeated use of lead-based cosmetics could cause serious health problems, including hair loss, muscle paralysis, and eventually death. Alongside whitening the skin, many women strove to achieve a smooth, hairless complexion. Facial hair, considered unsightly, was removed through plucking, shaving, or using depilatory creams made from harsh ingredients like quicklime and orpiment, a poisonous arsenic compound. Recipes for these creams warned users to avoid sensitive areas like the eyebrows, though accidents were common. Eyebrows themselves were often plucked or shaved to achieve a high forehead, another fashionable feature of the time. Some women went so far as to pluck back their hairlines to make their foreheads appear longer and more prominent, a style seen in many medieval portraits. Combined with pale skin and faint, carefully drawn-on brows, the overall effect was considered sophisticated and aristocratic. Lip color was sometimes enhanced using natural dyes. Beetroot juice, crushed berries, or mixtures of cochineal, a red pigment made from insects, were applied to the lips and cheeks to create a healthy glow. But always carefully, the ideal was not the vibrant color favored in later periods, but a soft, understated flush that suggested youth and vitality without appearing too earthy or sensual. Hair care, too, received significant attention. Clean, shiny hair was a prized asset. To maintain it, people used herbal rinses made from rosemary, sage, or chamomile. Combing was an essential daily practice. not only to detangle but to remove lice, a common nuisance even among the upper classes. Wealthier individuals might perfume their hair with oils or powders, both to smell pleasant and to display status. Hairstyling varied depending on fashion and practicality. Married women usually covered their hair with veils, wimples, or elaborate hairdresses. Young unmarried women, however, often wore their hair loose as a sign of purity. Braiding was common, both for style and convenience, and intricate plaits could signify a woman's social standing or wealth. Men, too, followed grooming standards. Beards went in and out of fashion depending on the era and region. In some periods, a clean-shaven face was seen as more refined, while in others, a carefully trimmed beard was the mark of a mature and respectable man. Haircuts varied from the simple bowl-cut styles of peasants to the more elaborate styles of knights and noblemen, often shaped and styled to fit under helmets or hats. Teeth received modest attention. As discussed earlier, people used cloths, twigs, and powders to clean their teeth. Fresh breath was a social concern, and many chewed herbs like parsley or mint after meals. Dental health was recognized as important, but without modern dentistry, treatments for toothaches were limited. Remedies ranged from herbal poultices applied to the jaw to more desperate measures like tooth extraction with simple metal tools. Nail care also had its place. Hands were constantly on display, especially among the nobility, and neatly trimmed nails signaled refinement. Some women colored their nails using plant dyes or buffed them with cloths to produce a natural sheen. Jewelry like rings and bracelets further highlighted well-cared-for hands, making grooming an important aspect of personal presentation. Clothing completed the look. Rich fabrics such as silk, velvet, and fine wool were favored by the upper classes, with colors like deep blue, crimson, and gold indicating wealth and status. Sumptuary laws often restricted who could wear certain colors or fabrics, reinforcing visible social hierarchies. Accessories like belts, brooches, and elaborate shoes allowed individuals to express personal taste within the limits of class expectations. Perfume was another tool of beauty and hygiene. Fragrant oils and waters were made from roses, violets, lavender, and spices like cinnamon and cloves. These scents helped mask less pleasant smells in crowded cities and demonstrated sophistication. Pomanders, small decorative containers filled with aromatic substances, were carried or worn on chains, providing a constant portable source of fragrance. It is important to note that while beauty standards were particularly emphasized among the wealthy, people across all social classes cared about appearance. A clean face, tidy hair, and presentable clothing were valued everywhere. In a society where social mobility was rare but reputation meant everything, looking respectable could be crucial to finding work, marriage, or patronage. In rural areas, beauty routines were simpler, but still present. Peasant women might rinse their hair with herbal infusions, wear their best clothing to church, and adorn themselves with simple jewelry made from base metals or glass beads. Young men took pride in keeping their tunics clean and their shoes mended. Beauty, though expressed differently, mattered at every level of society. Despite the dangers of some cosmetic practices, medieval grooming reflects an enduring human desire to be clean, attractive, and socially acceptable. Like us, medieval people understood that how they presented themselves affected how they were perceived, and how they perceived themselves. As we move forward, we step away from daily routines and into the fascinating world of medieval cuisine. What did people eat? What was considered a delicacy or a horror? The answers are often as surprising as they are revealing. Food was central to medieval life, not only for survival but as a marker of social status, tradition, and occasionally theatrical display. While the basics of the medieval diet were humble, bread, pottage, ale, the cuisine of the wealthy could venture into the truly bizarre. Strange foods and elaborate presentations turned dining into an art form, with dishes that would shock, amuse, or amaze guests. At the highest levels of society, meals were grand affairs. Nobles sought to impress visitors with exotic ingredients and creative culinary feats. One of the most extravagant and odd delicacies was roast swan. In medieval England and France, swans were prized not only for their beauty on lakes, but for their symbolic connection to royalty and elegance. During great feasts, swans were cooked, carefully redressed in their original feathers, and served as showpieces, often with their beaks gilded in gold leaf. The preparation was intricate. First, the swan would be roasted. Afterward, its feathers were carefully reapplied using skewers or stitching. Sometimes the bird was presented breathing fire, with a burning material placed inside the beak to astonish diners. Despite the theatrical presentation, swan meat was tough and not particularly flavorful. The experience mattered far more than the taste. Even stranger was the medieval church's classification of certain animals. Because religious fast days forbade eating meat from land animals, clever theologians redefined creatures like beavers as fish due to their aquatic habits and scaly tails. This allowed pious diners to enjoy roast beaver tail during Lent without technically breaking the rules. Otters and barnacle geese, birds believed to be born from driftwood or barnacles, were also reclassified as fish to sidestep fasting restrictions. Medieval creativity did not stop at redefining species. It extended to elaborate culinary illusions. A favorite banquet trick was to serve pies filled with live animals. Frogs, birds, or even squirrels were placed inside large pastry shells. When the pie was cut open, the creatures would leap or fly out, causing gasps and laughter among the guests. This tradition is thought to have inspired the nursery rhyme Sing a Song of Sixpence, which describes 24 blackbirds baked in a pie. Pies themselves were everywhere in medieval kitchens. Some were sweet, filled with fruits and spices. Others were savory, packed with minced meats, fish or even eels. Crusts were often thick and heavy, designed more as cooking vessels than as edible parts of the dish. In many cases, the pastry acted as a container to protect the filling during baking and travel, later discarded or fed to servants. Beyond spectacle, some foods simply seem strange to modern palates. Lampreys, jawless, eel-like fish, were highly prized among the nobility. King Henry I of England was famously so fond of lampreys that overindulgence supposedly contributed to his death. The fish were typically stewed with wine, spices, and sweeteners to mask their strong earthy flavor. Another curious dish was the cockentrice, a culinary chimera created by sewing together the front half of a pig and the rear half of a capon, or turkey. The two halves were stitched together, roasted as one creature, and presented whole at feasts. This elaborate fabrication symbolized wealth, imagination, and the blending of earthly and fantastical delights. In addition to the meat dishes, medieval banquets featured elaborate subtleties, edible sculptures and sugar work designed to impress. Tables might display castles made of jelly, ships carved from bread, or scenes constructed entirely from sugar and marzipan. These centerpieces were not just food, but conversation pieces, reinforcing the host's prestige and creativity. Everyday food for most people, however, was far simpler. Peasants and townsfolk lived primarily on bread, usually made from coarse grains like rye or barley, and pottage, a thick stew of vegetables, grains, and occasionally bits of meat. Ale and cider were common beverages, consumed daily by all ages, as water sources were often unsafe. Vegetables such as onions, leeks, cabbage, and beans formed the bulk of the diet. Fruits, when available, were eaten fresh in season or preserved by drying or fermenting. Dairy products like cheese and butter supplemented meals, and salted or smoked meats provided essential protein during the winter months. Still, even among the common folk, food had its festive moments. Seasonal feasts, harvest festivals, and religious celebrations offered chances to enjoy better fare. Roast meats, special pies, fresh breads, and spiced cakes. During these times, households would pool resources to create communal meals, sharing both labor and abundance. Preservation was crucial. Without refrigeration, medieval people developed ingenious methods to extend the life of food. Meat was salted, dried, or smoked. Fruits were boiled into jams or soaked in honey. Fish was heavily salted or pickled. Grains and root vegetables were stored in cool, dry cellars. These preservation techniques added distinctive flavors to medieval food, flavors that might seem overpowering to modern palates accustomed to fresh refrigeration. Spices, when available, transformed meals from bland to complex. Black pepper, cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg were highly prized and extraordinarily expensive. A merchant displaying access to exotic spices signaled wealth and cosmopolitan connections. Spices were used not only for flavor, but also for their perceived medicinal properties, balancing the humors of the body, according to contemporary theory. Salt was another vital commodity. Essential for preserving food and enhancing flavor, salt was so important that it influenced settlement patterns and trade routes. Some cities grew wealthy primarily through the production and trade of salt, leading to the expression worth one's salt to describe someone valuable. Medieval meals, whether humble or grand, reflected the rhythms of nature, the strictures of religion, and the creativity of cooks willing to blur the lines between nourishment and spectacle. Dining was an experience layered with meaning, from everyday pottage eaten from a shared pot to the golden swan delivered with trumpets at a lord's high table. As we move deeper into the world of medieval feasting, we find that food was not just about eating, it was about celebrating, competing, and displaying one's place in society. Our next journey leads us to explore the grand banquets, the rules of the table, and the theatrical excesses that defined medieval feasting culture. In the Middle Ages, a feast was far more than a meal. It was a statement of wealth, power, and hospitality, a theatrical performance where food, drink, music, and ceremony blended into a dazzling spectacle. For nobles and royalty, banquets were occasions to reinforce alliances, display status, and entertain guests with experiences they would never forget. A medieval banquet began long before the guests arrived. Preparation could take days, even weeks, involving cooks, servants, musicians, and stewards. Animals were slaughtered, spices imported, tableware polished. In grand households, entire kitchens sprang into action, roasting spits turning, pastry ovens glowing, sauces bubbling in vast pots. Every dish served was carefully chosen, not only for flavor, but for visual impact and symbolic meaning. Guests entered great halls decorated with banners, tapestries, and sometimes entire trees brought indoors for the occasion. Tables were laid out in long rows, covered with white linen cloths, a mark of refinement. Seating was strictly hierarchical. The lord and honored guests sat at the high table on a raised platform, while lesser attendees were arranged according to their status, stretching down the hall in decreasing importance. Feasts could include multiple courses, each featuring a bewildering variety of dishes. A typical sequence might begin with light appetizers, fruits, nuts, spiced wine, followed by heavier fare, roasted meats, pies, stews, and intricate subtleties crafted from sugar and marzipan. Fish dishes, pottages, and boiled fowl might fill the middle courses, while desserts like preserved fruits, custards, and decorated pastries rounded out the meal. Not every dish was intended for eating. Some were primarily decorative, designed to astonish rather than nourish. Enormous jellies, molded into castles, pies releasing live birds, or sugar sculptures depicting mythical scenes transformed the feast into a visual and sensory extravaganza. These subtleties, as they were called, showcased the host's wealth, imagination, and access to exotic ingredients. Music accompanied much of the banquet. Minstrels sang ballads or played lutes, harps, and drums. Jesters performed tricks and acrobatics, while dancers sometimes entertained between courses. On grander occasions, dramatic performances or mystery plays might be staged. The goal was constant engagement. No guest should be bored, and every moment was a reminder of the host's splendor. The food itself reflected medieval tastes, which favored bold, complex flavors. Sweet and savory were often combined in ways that might seem unusual today. Meat could be seasoned with cinnamon and sugar. Fish could be cooked with raisins and cloves. Sauces made from verjuice, a sour juice pressed from unripe grapes, added tangy brightness to rich dishes. Spices like ginger, pepper, and saffron were not just for flavor, but were seen as signs of sophistication and wealth, imported at great expense from distant lands. Drinking was an essential part of the festivities. Ale and wine flowed freely, with strong ales popular in northern regions and wines, both red and white, favored in southern Europe. Mead, a fermented honey drink, also made appearances, especially at earlier medieval tables. Drinks were served in ornate goblets, and communal toasts were common, reinforcing bonds of fellowship among guests. At royal courts, elaborate rituals surrounded drinking. Cupbearers, trusted servants responsible for the safety of the drinks, ensured that no poison touched their master's lips. Toasts to the health of the king, the queen, or honored visitors were frequent, often accompanied by elaborate ceremonies of lifting, saluting, and draining goblets in turn. Banquet etiquette was serious business. Guests were expected to behave with decorum, at least at the high table. Manuals of etiquette instructed diners to wash their hands before meals, not to scratch themselves at the table, not to blow their noses into the tablecloth, and to avoid speaking with a mouthful of food. Reaching across another guest's plate or cutting meat with one's personal knife was discouraged, as was drinking excessively, though excess was often overlooked during the height of celebration. Hand-washing ceremonies were a regular part of the meal. Before and after eating, basins of water and towels were brought around by servants, emphasizing not only hygiene, but also a sense of ritual purification. Bread acted both as food and as a utensil. Guests used chunks of stale bread called trenchers to scoop up sauces and pieces of meat. At the end of the meal, these used trenchers might be given to the poor or fed to animals. Feasts also reinforced religious rhythms. Certain days required meatless meals, where fish and vegetable dishes dominated. During Lent, elaborate non-meat feasts were crafted with the same care as regular banquets, using ingredients like fish, almond milk, and preserved fruits to create satisfying and impressive spreads. Eating fish on Fridays and during fasting periods was not just a religious obligation, but an opportunity for culinary creativity. In times of celebration, coronations, marriages, victories, feasts could stretch on for days. Tournaments, dances, and hunts often accompanied the main meals, creating a full festival atmosphere. Records from medieval England describe multi-day feasts where thousands of animals, deer, boars, geese, swans, were consumed, along with thousands of gallons of wine and ale. Of course, such extravagance was reserved for the few. For the majority of medieval Europeans, meals remained simple affairs centered on bread, pottage, and ale. Yet, even in the humblest homes, festivals like Christmas, Easter, and harvest celebrations offered chances to enjoy better fare, drink heartily, and gather in community. In all its forms, the medieval feast was a celebration of abundance, real or symbolic, and a powerful reminder of social order. Through food, music, and spectacle, medieval society reaffirmed who belonged where, who had power, and who could afford to share it. As we move forward, we'll look closer at another central pillar of medieval life. Not just what they ate and drank, but how deeply drink shaped daily habits, religious customs, and even public safety. The story of medieval brewing and drinking reveals a society constantly balancing pleasure, necessity, and peril. In the medieval world, drink was not just a luxury, it was a necessity. With clean drinking water often hard to find or unsafe, people of all ages turned to ale, mead, and wine as their daily beverages. Far from being reserved for celebrations or taverns, alcoholic drinks were an everyday staple, consumed with breakfast, supper, and sometimes even used in place of water altogether. Ale was by far the most common drink across much of Europe, especially in the British Isles and northern regions where grapes did not grow easily. Brewed from water, malted barley, and yeast, ale was rich in calories and nutrients, making it a crucial part of the peasant diet. Importantly, it was usually low in alcohol, what we might call small ale, and could be safely drunk in large quantities without intoxication. Even children drank it regularly. The brewing process involved boiling the mixture, which killed harmful bacteria and made ale a safer option than untreated water from wells or rivers. It also made ale one of the most vital domestic products. In many households, particularly in rural villages, ale was brewed at home in small batches. Women often managed this process, leading to the term alewife, a woman who brewed and sometimes sold ale from her own dwelling. Alehouses, distinct from taverns or inns, became important centers of local life. These were informal places where neighbors gathered to drink, exchange news, and conduct small trades. Because ale spoiled quickly, fresh batches were made constantly. In towns, ale conners, officials appointed by local councils, tested the quality and purity of ale, making sure brewers weren't watering it down or charging unfair prices. Mead, a fermented drink made from honey, was also popular, particularly in earlier centuries and among the wealthier classes. With its sweet, potent flavor and long shelf life, mead was associated with special occasions, feasts, and rituals. In some traditions, newly married couples were given a month's worth of mead, a custom that gave rise to the term honeymoon. Though it gradually declined in popularity as beer became more widespread, mead remained a symbol of festivity and abundance. Wine dominated in southern Europe, France, Spain, and Italy, where vineyards flourished. It was consumed regularly in cities and monasteries, sometimes watered down for everyday use and served stronger at banquets. Monks played a vital role in cultivating vineyards and refining winemaking techniques. Many of the wine-producing regions famous today, like Burgundy, Champagne, and Bordeaux, gained their early reputations in the medieval period. Wine was classified by color, strength, and sweetness. Red wines were considered robust and warming, while white wines were seen as more delicate. Sweet wines were especially prized. Some were spiced with cinnamon, ginger, and cloves, a tradition that led to drinks like hippocras and mulled wine. As with ale, wine was often safer than water and could be mixed with herbs for both flavor and supposed medicinal benefits. But while drinking was normal, even expected, the risks were well known. Alcohol abuse was not unknown in medieval society, and drunkenness was frequently condemned in sermons, law codes, and literature. Clergy warned of the spiritual dangers of overindulgence, linking drunkenness with sin and moral decay. Proverbs and poems mocked the foolish behavior of drunkards, and in many towns, public intoxication could lead to fines or time in the stocks. Still, drinking culture was deeply embedded in social life. To refuse a drink at a feast or gathering could be seen as rude or suspicious. Hospitality demanded a full cup, and toasts to health, loyalty, or saints were customary. Drinking games, songs, and challenges formed part of festive traditions, especially among university students and soldiers who gained reputations for wild behavior in taverns. Speaking of taverns, these were more formal establishments than alehouses, usually licensed by local authorities. Taverns sold wine, while alehouses specialized in ale. Inns provided both drink and lodging, often catering to travelers, pilgrims, and merchants. Some towns had strict rules separating these businesses, while others allowed them to overlap. The interiors ranged from smoky, crowded rooms to spacious halls with benches and long tables. For many, the tavern was not just a place to drink, but a hub of social and economic activity. Deals were struck, news was exchanged, and friendships were forged. Songs, music, and storytelling filled the air, as did the clatter of dice and the hum of gossip. While authorities sometimes tried to restrict tavern hours or limit their numbers, the popularity of these spaces was impossible to suppress. Drinking also intersected with religion in curious ways. Monasteries were centers of brewing and winemaking, and monks were often skilled brewers who supplied local communities. Ale brewed in monasteries was considered of high quality, and some orders became famous for their recipes. Religious feasts often included ceremonial drinking, and many saints were associated with specific beverages. Saint Arnold of Soissons, for example, was a patron of brewers. Yet, the tension between pleasure and piety lingered. Religious texts urged moderation, reminding readers that while wine could gladden the heart, it could also lead to ruin. Confession manuals listed drunkenness among sins requiring penance, but the line between festive drinking and sinful indulgence was often blurred, depending on time, place, and circumstance. The medieval relationship with alcohol was pragmatic and complex. It was a daily necessity, a form of entertainment, a social lubricant, a source of pride, and at times a moral hazard. Like so many aspects of medieval life, it balanced between survival and symbolism, community and caution. As we leave behind the clink of mugs and the warmth of the hearth, we head into an even stranger world, that of medieval festivals. These were moments when ordinary life was upended, rules were reversed, and chaos reigned, often with laughter, masks, music, and just a touch of madness. While daily medieval life was shaped by order, hierarchy, and routine, festivals offered moments when that structure could be joyfully and sometimes wildly overturned. Medieval festivals weren't just holidays, they were social release valves, carnivals of contradiction, where peasants dressed as kings, priests played fools, and towns erupted in music, mischief and ritual chaos. These celebrations were sanctioned disruptions, strange, theatrical, and deeply woven into the rhythms of the year. One of the most iconic of these was the Feast of Fools, celebrated across parts of Europe during the Christmas season, especially around New Year's. During this festival, lower-ranking clergy were allowed, even encouraged, to mock their superiors. Choirboys might dress up as bishops while the real priests played the part of servants or jesters. In some churches, mock liturgies were performed in gibberish Latin, incense was replaced with smoke from burning shoes, and animal noises echoed from the choir stalls. Outside the church, the atmosphere was equally raucous. Parades of costumed revelers marched through towns, masks and horns, adding to the noise. A fool bishop might be crowned, leading a mock ceremony filled with jokes and irreverence. It was, in many ways, a carefully controlled explosion of nonsense, a day when the sacred was deliberately turned on its head. But far from blasphemy, these events were often viewed as symbolic resets, allowing people to laugh at the structures that normally ruled their lives, before returning to them with renewed respect. Equally chaotic was the Feast of the Ass, another church-linked celebration, often held on January 14th. This bizarre holiday honored the donkey's role in biblical stories, particularly in Christ's flight into Egypt. In some churches, a young girl and child would be paraded on a donkey into the church during Mass. At one point, the entire congregation would bray like donkeys in unison instead of saying Amen. Far from disrespectful, the aim was to remember humility and sacred service, though not without a loud theatrical flair. Beyond the ecclesiastical world, seasonal festivals punctuated the calendar. Carnival, held before the start of Lent, was perhaps the wildest. In cities like Venice, Cologne, and Paris, Carnival was a time of masks, public feasts, pranks, dances, and wild costumes. People indulged in food, drink, and pleasure before the fasting and discipline of Lent began. Role reversals were common. Men dressed as women, servants mocked their masters, and fools were treated as royalty. These inversions symbolized more than comedy. They acknowledged the tension between human desires and religious expectations. May Day and midsummer festivals brought communities into the countryside. These celebrations were rooted in older, often pre-Christian traditions of fertility and seasonal renewal. Villagers decorated maypoles with ribbons, danced in circles, and crowned a May Queen. Bonfires were lit, herbs were burned for protection, and matchmaking was encouraged. Some of these rites blurred into superstition. Jumping over a fire was thought to bring luck. Collecting dew on midsummer morning could ensure beauty for the year ahead. In rural regions, harvest festivals celebrated the end of the agricultural cycle. Fields were blessed, sheaves of grain were woven into human shapes and carried in procession, and communities gathered to share food and drink. These feasts reinforced communal bonds, giving thanks for survival and looking ahead to winter. Though simpler than the urban carnival, they had their own magic, a celebration of toil, nature, and endurance. Music and performance played vital roles in every festival. Minstrels, jugglers, and mummers roamed from town to town, performing at fairs and feasts. Mummers' plays, short, often comedic theatrical performances, were a staple of community gatherings, featuring stock characters like St. George, the Turkish Knight, or the Fool. These plays mixed religious themes with slapstick humor and rough-and-ready costumes made from scraps and paint. Dancing was ubiquitous. Circle dances, line dances, and partnered reels all had their place. Often accompanied by flutes, drums, or bagpipes, dancing in public squares, churchyards, or even in the aisles of churches during festivals wasn't uncommon, though not always welcomed by clergy trying to keep decorum. Still, during major celebrations, the line between sacred and profane blurred, a tension that defined much of medieval life. One of the stranger festival customs was the boy bishop tradition. Around St. Nicholas Day, December 6, a choir boy was elected to serve as bishop for a brief period, usually until Holy Innocents' Day, December 28. During this time, The boy would wear full bishop's robes, lead processions, and sometimes even deliver sermons. Though it seems like simple child's play, the boy bishop tradition held deeper meaning, elevating the lowly to positions of honor, if only temporarily, in a symbolic echo of Christian humility. Festivals weren't always purely joyful. Some carried darker undertones. The dance of death, or dan macabre, was a recurring theme in festivals and church art. Especially after the Black Death, actors dressed as skeletons led mock processions, reminding audiences that death came for everyone, rich or poor, young or old. This eerie performance offered a strange comfort in a world where death was ever present. Humor and spectacle helped make sense of it. Despite, or perhaps because of their chaos, festivals were essential to medieval society. They broke up the grind of labor and reinforced the calendar's sacred and seasonal rhythms. They allowed space for emotional release, storytelling, laughter, and collective identity. They acknowledged human contradictions, the yearning for joy and the weight of duty, the hunger for pleasure and the call of faith. For medieval people, festivals didn't simply offer escape, they offered a momentary rebalancing of life itself. The sacred was made strange, and the ordinary was lifted into celebration. At least for a day, the world turned upside down, and in doing so, made a little more sense. As we move forward, we'll step away from the music and masks and dive into something far more serious, the everyday superstitions and magical beliefs that shaped how people understood their world, and the unseen forces they believed controlled their fate. In the medieval mind, the world was alive with signs. Every sound, animal, illness, or accident could carry meaning, and the line between natural and supernatural was not just blurred, it barely existed. For most people, superstition was not a fringe belief, but a core part of daily life. It shaped decisions, explained misfortunes, and offered a fragile sense of control in an unpredictable world. Omens were taken seriously. If a crow circled a house, someone inside might soon die. If a candle flickered without wind, it meant a spirit was present. Dreams were messages, sometimes warnings, sometimes revelations. Losing a tooth in a dream foretold the death of a family member. Seeing a hare cross your path before a journey was bad luck. A black cat crossing your threshold might bring misfortune or protection depending on local tradition. Animal behavior was watched closely. Dogs howling at night signaled approaching death. A rooster crowing at the wrong hour meant betrayal. If a cow gave birth to a deformed calf, it was seen not just as an animal mishap, but a divine warning. Creatures weren't just livestock or pests. They were messengers of the unseen. Weather signs were also believed to carry supernatural meaning. Sudden storms, especially during religious ceremonies, were interpreted as omens. Lightning striking a church or cross was seen as a terrifying sign of divine displeasure. Rainbows, eclipses, and comets stirred both awe and fear, heavenly messages no one could ignore. To protect themselves from misfortune, people turned to charms and amulets. These were often small, personal objects, a knotted cord, a carved stone, a bone, or a piece of iron. The iron horseshoe, for example, was nailed above doors to ward off witches. Keys were worn as symbols of protection and authority. Some wore pouches filled with herbs, bits of parchment, or animal teeth. These talismans were believed to guard against illness, bad luck, and evil spirits. One common charm was the written prayer, a folded piece of paper or parchment inscribed with sacred words or symbols. These could be carried in a pouch, stitched into clothing, or placed under a pillow. Even illiterate people valued these items for their spiritual power, trusting in the priest or scribe who prepared them. Protective inscriptions might include crosses, invocations of saints, or snippets of psalms and gospel verses. Superstitions extended into farming and childbirth, two areas full of danger and uncertainty. Farmers believed planting by the phases of the moon could affect the success of their crops. Cutting hay at the wrong time might cause blight. A sick cow might be cured by whispering a prayer into its ear, or placing a charm under its stall. Childbirth was surrounded by protective rituals. Midwives used prayers, herbs, and sacred objects to guard both mother and infant. Iron tools might be placed under the birthing bed to keep away spirits. In some regions, water from holy wells was sprinkled on the threshold to protect the house. Babies were not left unattended for fear of being changelings, swapped by fairies for a look-alike child. To prevent this, parents might place iron scissors near the cradle or tie red ribbons to a baby's clothing. Witches and magic workers were believed to pose constant threats. A sudden illness, bad harvest, or spoiled milk could all be blamed on witchcraft. Accusations were more likely in times of hardship, but even in peaceful periods, the fear lingered. Curses were thought to carry real power. To defend against them, people used counter spells, spoken charms, reversed prayers, or symbolic gestures. In some areas, spinning around 3 times, crossing fingers, or spitting over the shoulder were seen as ways to break a curse. The sign of the cross was made over bread, drink, and sleeping children. Doors and windows were marked with chalk on holy days. These acts were small but potent, daily armor against unseen forces. The church walked a fine line with superstition. Official doctrine warned against magic, charms, and folk rituals. But in practice, many clergy tolerated or even encouraged certain practices, especially when blended with Christian elements. A prayer pinned to a shirt was preferable to a pagan incantation, a relic of a saint offered in place of a forest spirit. This blending of folk belief and religious ritual created a unique cultural middle ground, part scripture, part superstition. Superstition also played into justice. As we've seen, ordeals and trials sometimes relied on signs, but even outside the courtroom, people looked for supernatural evidence. A murder victim's body bleeding in the presence of the killer was one such belief. Another was crewontation, the idea that a corpse could speak or move to reveal guilt. While rare in practice, such belief reinforced the idea that the invisible world judged human actions. Astrology was another common tool for interpreting fate. The positions of stars and planets were believed to influence personality, health, and events. Birth charts were created, fortunes told, and major decisions, from marriage to warfare, were sometimes timed with celestial advice. Certain days were considered unlucky, especially for travel or legal contracts. Friday the 13th, although more modern in origin, echoes this medieval anxiety about time and fate. Even numbers and shapes carried meaning. The number 3 was holy, reflecting the Trinity. 7 was powerful, associated with the days of the week, the deadly sins and the sacraments. Circles protected, triangles invoked, divine harmony, and spirals were seen in both healing and harmful symbols. What's striking about medieval superstition is not just how strange it seems now, but how deeply it reflected people. A world without microscopes or germ theory, where life could change overnight due to disease, famine, or war, superstition provided explanation and comfort. It allowed people to act, to wear a charm, speak a prayer, mark a door, instead of facing the unknown in silence. As we move from the invisible world of superstition into the labor of daily life, our next steps bring us face to face with some of the strangest occupations in medieval society. Jobs that few would envy, but all depended on. Every society needs people to do the jobs no one wants to talk about. In the Middle Ages, some of the most essential roles were also the strangest, unpleasant, dangerous, and often steeped in superstition or stigma. These were the people who kept cities livable, fears manageable, and rituals complete. They worked in the shadows, but their roles tell us volumes about what medieval society valued, feared, and tried to ignore. Perhaps the most notorious of these jobs belonged to the gong farmer. The name sounds strange, but the task was painfully clear. Gong farmers were responsible for cleaning out latrines, cesspits, and privies. In a world without modern sewage systems, human waste collected quickly in underground pits, especially in castles and urban centers. When these filled up, someone had to go down and dig it out by hand. Armed with buckets, long-handled shovels, and a strong stomach, gong farmers worked at night to avoid offending the public. The waste, euphemistically called night soil, was carted out of town and sometimes used as fertilizer. The job was revolting and dangerous. Toxic fumes in enclosed spaces could suffocate workers, and disease was an ever-present risk. Yet the pay was surprisingly good. Danger money for enduring what others could not bear. Despite the decent wages, gong farmers lived on the margins of society. Their work was essential, but their presence was avoided. People crossed the street to avoid the stench that clung to them, and few would knowingly shake a gong farmer's hand. Still, without them, cities would have been overwhelmed by their own filth. Just as cities had to deal with physical waste, they also wrestled with spiritual burden, and here entered the strange figure of the sin eater. Found mostly in parts of Britain and Central Europe, the sin eater was a person, often poor or outcast, paid to take on the sins of the dead. The ritual was simple and unsettling. When someone died, a piece of bread or cake and a bowl of ale were placed on the corpse or passed over it. The sin eater would then consume the food and drink, symbolically absorbing the deceased's sins, so their soul could rest in peace. In doing so, the sin eater became a vessel for the spiritual residue no one else wanted. These individuals were not part of the official church and were often viewed with suspicion or fear. Some believed sin eaters carried a spiritual contagion, a soul weighed down by the sins of others. Though the church disapproved of the practice, it persisted, especially in poor rural areas where access to clergy was limited or where folk traditions remained strong. Few professions combined danger and spectacle as completely as the bear would. These men kept and trained bears, not for protection or farming, but for entertainment. Bear baiting was a popular pastime in medieval and early modern Europe. In this cruel sport, a bear was chained in a pit while dogs were released to attack it. The crowd would watch, cheer, and place bets on the outcome. Bearwoods were responsible for capturing, feeding, and transporting these powerful animals. They had to train them to tolerate human contact, or at least not kill their handlers, and to perform tricks or participate in fights. Injuries were common, and fatalities weren't unheard of. Bearwoods lived dangerous lives, often on the move, with their animals in tow. Because they dealt with exotic beasts, bearwoods sometimes carried a touch of mystery. They might be called upon to control unruly crowds or animals, and were occasionally seen as possessing secret knowledge about nature or even magic. But their trade was also deeply violent, a reflection of an era where entertainment and brutality often went hand in hand. Another job on the outer edges of society was that of the executioner. Though vital to the justice system, executioners were both feared and needed. They carried out beheadings, hangings, floggings, and other public punishments. Their presence was a reminder of state power, yet they were rarely welcomed in polite company. In many places, executioners lived outside the city walls, or had to wear special clothing to mark their role. Families often passed down the trade, as few outsiders wanted to take it on. Still, skilled executioners could earn respect, not affection, but a grudging professional admiration. A clean, swift beheading was seen as merciful, and some headsmen became semi-famous for their precision. Not all strange jobs were grim, some were just bizarre. Professional mourners, often women, were hired to cry loudly and dramatically at funerals, ensuring that the deceased received a suitably emotional send-off. In some regions, it was believed that more wailing meant more honor for the dead, and that the soul would find peace faster if accompanied by sincere-sounding grief. Another curious role was the herb woman, or cunning man, village healers and charm makers, who straddled the line between medicine and magic. They treated wounds, delivered babies, created love potions, and warded off curses. Sometimes respected, sometimes feared, they filled a vital gap in communities far from licensed doctors or formal churches. And then there were rat catchers, whose job was exactly what it sounds like. In towns infested with rodents, a serious health risk even before the Black Death, these men used trained animals, poison, or brute force to reduce rat populations. They were necessary, often successful, and entirely uncelebrated. All these jobs reflect the hidden labor of medieval life, the unpleasant, the strange, the dangerous, and the essential. They show that survival in the Middle Ages wasn't just about knights and kings. It was about the people who cleaned the waste, buried the dead, entertained the crowds, and absorbed the fears others dared not face. In the next section, we turn from the jobs of the living to the rituals of the dead, the strange, solemn, and sometimes theatrical customs that shaped how medieval people prepared for the end, mourned the lost, and remembered the departed. In the Middle Ages, death was never far away. War, famine, disease, and accident claimed lives regularly, and life expectancy was short. Yet for all its familiarity, death was not treated lightly. Medieval society surrounded it with ritual belief and powerful symbolism, from solemn funerals to bizarre post-mortem events. The way people handled death reveals how they made sense of life's end and what might lie beyond it. Funeral customs varied depending on wealth, region, and religious standing, but certain elements were common across Europe. When someone died, family or neighbors closed the person's eyes, bound the jaw with a cloth, and positioned the body for viewing. Candles were lit around the corpse, and prayers were said to guide the soul through purgatory, the transitional state between death and heaven, where most believed souls were purified of their sins. The body was washed, dressed, often in simple robes or a shroud, and displayed in the home for a wake. Wakes could be quiet and reverent, or in some areas more social events where family and community gathered to share food, drink, and memories. In some regions, people told jokes or stories to lighten the mood, blending mourning with a celebration of the person's life. Burial was typically within a few days, especially in warmer climates. The dead were interred in churchyards, often close to the walls of the church itself, believed to offer protection and holiness. Wealthier individuals might be buried inside the church, sometimes near the altar or in crypts below. Elaborate tombstones or effigies marked noble graves, while simpler markers or wooden crosses identified others. Grave goods. Objects buried with the deceased were not as common in Christian medieval Europe as in earlier pagan traditions, but they did appear. Rosaries, religious medals, or items of personal importance might be tucked into the shroud. In rare cases, weapons were buried with knights, or books with scholars, symbolizing their identity in life and death. The idea of the memento mori, Latin for remember you must die, became increasingly common. Images of skulls, skeletons, hourglasses, and dancing corpses appeared in books, art, and even architecture. These reminders served both as spiritual warnings and moral lessons. Life was fleeting, and everyone, kings, peasants, bishops, would one day return to dust. Some medieval beliefs about death ventured into the downright strange. In parts of Europe, people held corpse trials, literal legal proceedings involving dead bodies. These occurred most famously in the Cadaver Synod of 1897, when Pope Stephen VI had the rotting corpse of his predecessor, Pope Formosus, exhumed, dressed in papal robes, and placed on trial for alleged crimes. The dead pope, of course, did not respond, but was found guilty nonetheless. His body was stripped of its sacred garments and thrown into the Tiber River. While extreme, this trial wasn't entirely unique. Dead nobles, clerics, and even animals were occasionally tried posthumously to strip them of honor, property, or burial rights. These events reflected the deeply symbolic nature of justice in the Middle Ages, where public ritual often mattered more than practicality. Equally surreal were the dancing plagues that swept through parts of medieval Europe. The most famous outbreak occurred in 1518 in Strasbourg, where dozens of people danced uncontrollably in the streets for days, some reportedly to the point of exhaustion or death. Contemporary accounts describe men and women leaping, swaying, and spinning for hours on end, unable to stop. The causes remain mysterious. Some historians suggest mass hysteria, perhaps triggered by stress or fear. Others point to ergot poisoning, a hallucinogenic mold that grows on rye and can cause convulsions and delusions. Regardless of the source, communities often interpreted these events as divine punishment or spiritual possession. Priests held processions, and musicians were even hired to play for the dancers in hopes of easing their suffering. Another curious custom was the danse macabre, or dance of death, an allegorical motif that appeared in paintings, woodcuts, and performances. Skeletons danced with kings, peasants, clergy, and merchants, leading them to the grave in a macabre parade. The message was stark, but democratic. Death comes for all, regardless of wealth or status. These images were not meant to frighten, but to educate. They reminded viewers of their mortality and the need to live virtuously. In some cases, actual dances were staged during festivals or funerals, with costumed performers enacting the passage from life to death. The imagery was grim, but the intention was deeply moral. Church bells played a key role in death rituals. The passing bell tolled as someone lay dying, alerting the community to pray for the soul. After death, the death knell sounded, followed by a funeral peal on the day of burial. These sonic markers punctuated the stages of grief and reinforced the communal nature of death. Prayers for the dead did not end at the grave. Families continued to sponsor masses for the soul's release from purgatory. Sometimes for years, wealthier individuals left money in their wills to endow perpetual prayers, a form of spiritual insurance that showed both faith and foresight. Graveyards were not just places of rest, but social spaces. People met there, prayed there, and even held markets and fairs in churchyards. Bones unearthed from older graves were sometimes stacked in ossuaries or displayed in bone chapels. Strange, quiet reminders of the cycles of life. Despite its darkness, medieval death culture was not without comfort. Ritual, prayer, and community support offered structure to a chaotic moment. Belief in an afterlife, reinforced by visual art and religious teaching, gave people hope that death was not the end, but a passage. As we move from the grave back into the world of the living, we'll follow the paths of pilgrims and travelers, those who risked the roads of medieval Europe for faith, trade, or survival, facing dangers that modern tourists can scarcely imagine. To modern eyes, travel in the Middle Ages might seem limited or rare, but in truth, medieval people moved far more than we often imagine. Pilgrims journeyed across continents in search of sacred sites. Merchants crossed borders for profit. Messengers and scholars rode between cities, and peasants traveled to markets or fled from war and famine. Travel was part of medieval life, but it was never easy, and rarely safe. One of the most common and respected reasons for travel was the pilgrimage. These religious journeys ranged from short walks to a local shrine to months-long treks across Europe and even into the Holy Land. The goal was spiritual: to honor a saint, fulfill a vow, seek healing, or perform penance for sins. The destination might be the shrine of St. Thomas Becket in Canterbury, Santiago de Compostela in Spain, Rome, or even Jerusalem. Pilgrims often traveled in groups for safety and companionship. They wore distinctive clothing such as the scallop shell of Santiago and carried staffs, pouches, and badges to identify themselves. Along major routes, monasteries and hospices offered lodging, meals, and medical care. Though conditions varied, pilgrimage was seen as noble and virtuous, but it could be grueling. Roads were rough, weather unpredictable, and dangers plentiful. Highway robbery was one of the biggest threats. Long stretches of road, especially those running through forests or mountainous terrain, offered perfect cover for bandits. Travelers were often ambushed, stripped of belongings, and in some cases murdered. Wealthy travelers hired guards or traveled with armed escorts. Poorer pilgrims relied on the protection of the group, and often prayed. To address this threat, some regions organized road watchers, local men tasked with patrolling major routes and responding to reports of theft or violence. In other cases, tolls paid at bridges or gates were used to fund basic security. Still, for many, each journey was an act of faith, not just in God, but in the hope of surviving to the next village. Roads themselves were often in poor condition. Roman roads still crisscrossed parts of Europe, but many had decayed. Dirt paths turned to rivers of mud in wet seasons and became treacherously hard and rutted when dry. Bridges were rare, and river crossings could be deadly. Ferrymen offered passage at key points, but not all were trustworthy. Floods, capsized boats, and aggressive toll collectors added to the hazards. Inns provided shelter, but quality varied wildly. A good inn might offer a warm fire, a meal, and a clean bed. A bad one might provide fleas, theft, or worse. Prices fluctuated, and travelers often had to negotiate. Some inns were run by monasteries or guilds and had basic standards. Others operated without oversight. Tales abound of innkeepers overcharging, drugging guests, or even killing and robbing them, though such stories may have been more legend than widespread truth. Despite the dangers, travel served many functions. Merchants journeyed to trade fairs and ports, forming the backbone of Europe's expanding economy. Cloth from Flanders, spices from the East, and wines from France were carried by wagon, cart, and ship. These merchants braved more than bad roads. They also faced piracy, corrupt officials, and shifting border controls as they passed through different jurisdictions. Scholars and students also traveled frequently. The great universities of Paris, Bologna, and Oxford attracted pupils from across Europe. These traveling students, known as clerks, were easily recognized by their robes and books. They moved between cities seeking masters in philosophy, law, or medicine, spreading ideas and forming the beginnings of a pan-European intellectual culture. Messengers, both official and private, were a constant presence on the roads. Kings, lords, and bishops needed reliable communication, and trained riders delivered letters sealed with wax and ribbon. Some of these messengers were part of organized courier systems, especially in larger kingdoms or church networks. Others were more informal, trusted servants or tradesmen carrying letters between contacts. Religion provided not only motivation for travel, but also infrastructure. Monasteries offered food and beds to pilgrims and travelers, following Christian obligations of hospitality. Way stations, known as hospices, dotted major pilgrimage routes. Some were large complexes with chapels and infirmaries. Others were simple shelters. These institutions helped maintain safe corridors for the devout and reinforced the social fabric of Christian Europe. Travel wasn't limited to the religious and professional. Ordinary people moved too out of necessity. Peasants fled war, famine, or rising rents. Wandering laborers sought seasonal work, especially during harvests. Some became vagabonds, drifting between towns and occasionally facing suspicion or arrest. Cities passed laws requiring beggars and travelers to carry permits or risk being expelled. For women, travel carried additional risks and restrictions. Female pilgrims usually traveled in groups or with male relatives for safety. Women traders, midwives, and nuns also journeyed, but with more caution. In rare cases, women disguised themselves as men to make travel safer or to enter spaces normally closed to them. Travel also meant exposure to new ideas and dangers. Diseases moved along the same roads as people, spreading faster than ever before. The plague, for instance, followed trade routes and ships, devastating cities connected by commerce. At the same time, knowledge, technology, and stories spread along those same paths, linking distant communities in subtle ways. Despite the constant danger, medieval people continued to move. They carried relics, letters, spices, fabrics, and ideas across rough terrain and hostile borders. They walked for weeks to touch a saint's tomb, or rode for days to deliver a message sealed with wax. They took to the roads because they had to, and sometimes because they believed that the journey itself could save their soul. As we leave the roads behind, our next steps take us into the heart of medieval towns, where markets bustled, trades thrived, and the rules of daily life were enforced with surprising creativity. Medieval towns were loud, crowded, and full of life. Far from being sleepy backwaters, they were dynamic centers of trade, craftsmanship, gossip, and negotiation. While rural villages revolved around farming and seasonal labor, towns pulsed with markets, guilds, and a constant need to keep the peace among hundreds or thousands of tightly packed people. Order was essential, but in towns it didn't always come from the top down. Much of it was self-regulated, a balance of tradition, custom, and community expectation. Markets were the lifeblood of medieval towns. Weekly or bi-weekly market days brought in farmers, merchants, peddlers, and customers from miles around. Temporary stalls were set up in open squares. Goods were displayed in baskets, barrels, and carts, and the air was filled with the sounds of haggling, animals, music, and street performers. Almost anything could be bought or sold: bread, meat, fish, cloth, shoes, pots, tools, herbs, ribbons, candles, and even live animals. Towns competed for the right to host markets, which had to be granted by a royal charter. These charters gave legal protection to merchants and allowed towns to collect fees and taxes. They also established market laws, strict rules about weights and measures, prices, and where goods could be sold. Selling bad meat or shortchanging customers could lead to public punishment, like a stint in the pillory, or being chased out of town with jeers. Food was inspected regularly. Bread too small for its price was confiscated, and dishonest bakers were fined or forced to give away loaves for free. Ale was tasted by ale conners, officials tasked with ensuring its quality and volume. False measures, such as using a smaller than standard pint, were serious offences. Punishments weren't just fines, they were theatrical. A cheating brewer might be paraded through town with a fake barrel on their head as a warning to others. Towns weren't just places to buy things, they were places where things were made. Most crafts and trades were organised into guilds, powerful associations that regulated work, maintained quality, and protected members. There were guilds for weavers, blacksmiths, cobblers, masons, butchers, tailors, and more. Joining a guild wasn't easy. Young apprentices spent years learning their trade under a master, often living in his home and doing basic tasks in exchange for training. After apprenticeship, a craftsman became a journeyman, allowed to work for pay but not yet considered a master. To reach the highest rank, he had to create a masterpiece, a sample of work judged by the guild elders. Only if it met their strict standards could he open his own workshop and take on apprentices of his own. Guilds set prices, wages, and work hours. They also took care of members in hard times, funding funerals, helping widows, and supporting sick workers. In many towns, guilds were more powerful than the local government. Some had their own chapels, processions, and even festivals. Their colourful banners and patron saints added to the rich visual culture of urban life. The rules of town life didn't stop with trade. Every aspect of behaviour, from building maintenance to street cleanliness, was subject to regulation. Town officials enforced curfews, banned certain weapons, and inspected houses for fire hazards. Roofs made of thatch were discouraged in favour of tile or slate to prevent the rapid spread of fires. Open flames were restricted after dark, and fines were issued for throwing waste into the street, though this last rule was often ignored. Public order was maintained by a mix of town guards, watchmen, and community policing. People were expected to report crimes and help capture criminals. Night watches were common. Townspeople took turns patrolling the streets with lanterns and clubs. Bells signaled curfew, fire, or emergency, and in times of unrest, gates were closed and walls manned by citizen militias. Towns were built tight, streets were narrow, winding, and often unpaved. Buildings leaned toward each other across alleys, and upper stories sometimes touched overhead. Waste ran down open gutters in the middle of the street. Despite the filth, townspeople took pride in their homes, sweeping doorsteps, hanging herbs for scent, and whitewashing walls for brightness. Religion was woven into town life. Churches stood at the center, both physically and spiritually. Bells rang for prayer, work, and warning. Guilds maintained chapels, and local saints were celebrated with processions and feasts. In some places, mystery plays, dramatic reenactments of Bible stories were performed by guild members in public squares, turning the streets into stages. Education, too, found a foothold in towns. Grammar schools taught Latin and theology to boys destined for church or university careers. Some towns had scribes and booksellers. Literacy was still rare, but slowly growing. Universities in cities like Paris, Bologna, and Oxford drew students from across Europe, making towns hubs not only of trade, but of thought.